That one time a Japanese corporation used the Second Amendment to conquer America, on this fifth episode of Good Intentions. It may seem hard to comprehend in this era of televised anime and convenience store sushi, but Nintendo's challenge in bringing the Famicom to the American market in the 80s was as much cultural as logistical. Sure, the reluctance of retailers to carry yet another game system after being burned so badly on unsold console stock after the Atari crash presented a massive obstacle, but so too did the fact that many Americans just didn't like Japan. The generation that had fought against Japan in World War II, perhaps suffering injuries or losing friends and loved ones in the Pacific Theater, ran the show in the 80s. They still remembered the war, and that, at the time, Japan had been the only nation ever to launch a military attack against American soil. Anti-Japan sentiment, fueled by war and by propaganda by even such pillars of pop culture as Bugs Bunny and Dr. Seuss, was hard to let go of. Sure, the Allies defeated Japan with horrifying finality by leaving radioactive scars where two cities had once stood, but resentment doesn't fade easily. Japan certainly didn't ameliorate those grievances when the country overcame its resounding World War II defeat by building itself into an industrial powerhouse. By the time the NES launched, that poor little ruin of a nation had somehow gone from humbled in wartime defeat to poised to conquer the global economy.
You are terminated! Terminated? No! No! It was
As the 70s became the 80s, Japanese corporations took advantage of the same oil crisis that had caused Nintendo so much trouble, pushing its fuel-efficient cars as an alternative to Detroit's unionized gas guzzlers.
People were paying huge premiums to own a Japanese car. You couldn't give away a Cadillac. Sales fell apart. Dealers were going out of business.
Electronics companies like Sony introduced innovative devices like the Walkman. Japanese interests bought up American properties. Bad memories and alarming business trends mixed into an unfriendly climate for Nintendo's Famicom export plans. It was making a bold move into the American living room directed at the minds and hearts of innocent American children, supplanting failed American businesses in the process. The potential for bad feelings and pushback ran high. Now, corporations don't come much more Japanese than Nintendo. From the company's name to its history as a manufacturer of Hanafuda playing cards, Nintendo had nearly a century of being staunchly and traditionally Japanese under its belt at the time of the NES launch. But Nintendo also had a long history of navigating tricky cultural climates, from early 20th century laws that banned gambling in Japan to the hardships of the post-World War II era. President Hiroshi Yamauchi knew better than to run headlong into the massive and challenging US market, and Nintendo had built up its overseas presence slowly over time. First with distribution partners, then by establishing its own overseas distribution branch under Minoru Arakawa. Nintendo's approach went deeper than simply building a logistics chain, though. The company also relied heavily on a team of Americans who understood the realities of their home market. Though Nintendo's Japanese executive team called the shots both then as now, the particulars of the company's entry into the American home market were largely determined by the likes of Howard Lincoln and Gail Tilden. It was the US team that directed the console's marketing as it journeyed into the States, not only branding the system but also tweaking its design for the US market. Arakawa's staff played a big part in deciding which games would reach American retail, helping to winnow out games that wouldn't appeal to American interests, such as Fornin Uchi Mahjong, or might offend American moral sensibilities. For instance, presumably culling Devil World from the US lineup in response to fears about purported ties between games like Dungeons & Dragons to Satanism. A huge part of the Famicom's conversion into the NES involved its appearance, making it appeal to American tastes while sneaking it past Gameaverse retail buyers. The bright red and white Famicom looked far too much like a toy for the US, where consoles had been cast in stoic blacks and wood-grain paneling to resemble stereo equipment. Nintendo initially redesigned the console to take on a sleek science fiction look, less stodgy than earlier consoles and a reflection of the changing tastes of the mid-80s new wave aesthetic, yet still undeniably resembling a piece of powerful consumer entertainment technology. That still wasn't enough for American retailers, who could only see the fact that this was still basically the same thing as the ColecoVisions that were cluttering KB and Toys R Us stockrooms across America. The final NES ended up looking more like a VHS deck, including a clever, if ultimately failure-prone front-loading slot that required players to insert cartridges as if they were videotapes. And it shipped alongside two peripherals, Rob, the robot operating buddy, and the Zapper light gun. Rob ended up looking almost exactly the same in the US as he did in Japan, save for a color variation, presumably because Rob was designed as a gimmick specifically for the US market. The Zapper, on the other hand, looked almost nothing like its Japanese version. In Japan, Nintendo had pushed Wild Gunman pretty hard due to its remarkable legacy in that country. Fittingly, the Famicom light gun resembled an Old West six-shooter perfectly, a solid black revolver that even came with a holster for players to wear. The American version couldn't have been more different. While it retained the same basic pistol shape and light-sensing technology of the Japanese gun, it abandoned the Winchester look of the Wild Gunman pack-in favor of something that resembled a Luger from 200 years in the future. The sci-fi look of the Zapper didn't tie it to any particular one of Nintendo's early light gun games, which tended to be grounded in more real-world settings, the Wild West, police work, or hunting birds. On the other hand, it also didn't cause quite so much consternation among parents about gun safety. Satanism from tabletop RPGs wasn't the only parental scare of the mid-80s in America. There were far more substantial and substantiated fears resulting from kids being shot by police for playing around with too realistic toy guns and causing confusion. The conversation around these hazards would eventually lead to laws requiring all toy guns to feature bright safety colors. But in the meantime, Nintendo wisely undertook some self-censorship. It was a smart move. Speaking from personal experience as an 80s kid, my parents refused to let me have a Transformers Megatron figure, because it changed form into a convincing Walther P-38 replica. But Shockwave, who could become a ridiculous purple space gun, was A-OK. Likewise, the Zapper with its Buck Rogers look was no problem. No one would ever mistake it for a real weapon, even before it was given its safety orange makeover in 1989. The sci-fi American Zapper had another, more subtle benefit as well. It became game agnostic. Where the Japanese gun's revolver-like stylings tied it permanently to Wild West shootout Wild Gunman, Zapper didn't feel specific to any particular piece of software. That turned out to be important in the US because Americans didn't particularly gravitate toward Wild Gunman. Instead, it was a different Zapper game that won our hearts and minds over here: Duck Hunt. According to NES hardware designer Masayuki Uemura, Duck Hunt was the game that convinced Nintendo its plans to export the Famicom had potential, despite the doom and gloom of American retailers. Corporate buyers could argue that American kids wouldn't want to play video games, but the rousing success of Duck Hunt's arcade trial run in the Versus system suggested otherwise. And really, the gun's popularity made perfect sense. As Uemura noted in his presentation at NYU a few months ago, Americans love guns. The United States was built on the use of guns to kick out the British and to drive Native Americans from their land. When the framers of the Constitution sat down to pen their first round of revisions, the right to bear arms came second only after the right of free expression. Americans use guns for war, for hunting, for sport, and even apparently for grocery shopping now. Naturally, a game that let players hold a gun and shoot targets on the screen would do well here. But that's a glib assessment. Duck Hunt wasn't the only light gun game to come to American arcades before the NES launch. It was accompanied on the Versus system by Hogan's Alley. So how come that didn't perform as well? Simply put, Duck Hunt is a brilliant game. It's simplistic, yes, but that's part of its appeal. Duck Hunt demanded more than simple quick-draw reflexes. Wild Gunman and Hogan's Alley's rival shooters were fixed, stationary targets who tested players' ability to fire in response to a challenge. Duck Hunt, on the other hand, presented players with moving targets, a host of ducks that would take to the air, flutter around unpredictably for a moment, then take off for safer spaces. While its targets offered a more generous window of time in which to take them down than in Wild Gunman, their quick, erratic movements demanded skillful aiming. The randomized unpredictability of the ducks perfectly complemented the game's interface. In an era where game control schemes had yet to settle into full standards, Duck Hunt offered refreshing directness. Nintendo would repeat this conceptual success 2 decades later with Wii Sports, but in 1984 nothing felt more natural than gunning down flying birds. Duck Hunt did offer a few play mechanics to keep things lively. Besides the randomized motion of the birds, they also came in 3 different forms, color-coded to represent their trickiness. The green-headed black ducks were the slowest moving and thus the easiest to take down, while the brown ones were dauntingly fast, perhaps as a way to overcompensate for looking so boring. As with Wild Gunman, Duck Hunt came in 2 modes, one in which ducks appeared singly, and one in which they emerged in pairs. The third mode offered an even greater departure from the standard game than Wild Gunman's gang mode did. It dropped the ducks altogether in favor of a clay target shoot. A round of Duck Hunt worked simply. Your canine companion would leap into the brush to scare up some fowl, startling ducks into the air 1 or 2 at a time. Each duck would flap around for a few seconds, and if you didn't manage to shoot it with one of the 3 rounds you were given, it would escape off-screen and count as a miss. After 10 ducks had either been gunned down or fluttered to freedom, the round would end and the player's score would be tallied. Each successful shot would register on the scoreboard as a red kill icon, and provided you took down enough ducks to push the red tally past the score indicator beneath the icons, you would advance to the next round. A game of Duck Hunt ended when you failed to meet your requisite score. a requirement that increased every few rounds, causing the difficulty to ramp up alongside the ever faster motion of the birds. And that's about all there was to it. Besides the intuitive design of the point-and-shoot interface, what made the game so addictive in spite of its simplicity was its whimsical personality. Sure, you were gunning down innocent wildlife, but Nintendo's cartoonish visual design made it seem so inoffensive. Shoot a duck and its eyes would bug comically before it plummeted to the ground to be held aloft by your dog. Miss, and of course your dog would rise from the rushes for a moment to snicker at your incompetence. Part of the game's arcade success probably came from the fact that you could blast the dog for mocking you. A socially irresponsible but deeply cathartic feature, understandably excised from the home release. But really, it was just a great-looking game with an intuitive interface and addictive design. Naturally, Duck Hunt has deep roots in Nintendo history. The NES game, like Wild Gunman, drew heavy influence from 70s-era attractions based on an early form of the light gun technology that eventually made its way to the console. In fact, both game variants in the Duck Hunt video game were based on Nintendo creations from the 70s. The clay shooting extra mode is taken from Nintendo's very first shooting installation attraction, which was created as a sort of hermit crab venture to give bowling alley operators something to do with all their unused square footage once Japan's short-lived 60s bowling fad died off. That project ended up being a disaster for Nintendo since the OPEC oil crisis put the squeeze on leisure activities and no one could afford a pricey leisure shooting installation. The so-called laser clay shooting system's failure led to the creation of Wild Gunman as a way of repurposing the technology into a more compact and affordable format, one the size of a photo booth rather than an entire bowling alley. In scaling down the technology even further, Nintendo designer Gunpei Yokoi came up with a version that was suitable for home use. The result, Kosenju Duck Hunt, belonged to the same family as the company's other light-based toys, though its light tech proved to be considerably more sophisticated. Where most Kosenju series toys consisted of simple static targets that had to be shot in a small light sensor in order to register a hit, Duck Hunt presented moving targets. Players didn't aim at toys with Duck Hunt, but instead fired at animated projections. The light gun's beam would reflect off the wall, and a successful hit against a duck would travel along the same path that the bird projection took. In doing so, it would strike a light sensor located next to the duck projector and cause the animated birds to switch frames and movements to simulate falling. It was an incredibly clever piece of technology that could be used in any living room with a bit of clear wall space, and Duck Hunt for NES simply took the concept to its next logical step. It retained the basic game elements of the Kosenju release, added a healthy dose of speed and randomization, threw in a persnickety dog as a companion, and greatly reduced the complexity and space needed for play by compacting everything down to a console, a controller, and a TV. And really, Duck Hunt predates even that technology. Sega pioneered the art of pretending to kill innocent waterfowl with a 1969 game called, yes, Duck Hunt. While it operated on an electromechanical system that lacked the sophistication of Nintendo's light and projection system, the similarities between the two games probably aren't a complete coincidence. In time, Sega would launch its own console, the Master System, with its own Zapper-like light gun, the Light Phaser. The Master System never had a light gun quite as simple yet appealing as Duck Hunt though, proving once again that even in the fiercest console war, it's ultimately software quality that wins the day. Nintendo shipped Duck Hunt as a pack-in game for consoles that included the Zapper throughout most of the NES's life. At the system's launch, Duck Hunt and the Zapper came bundled with the deluxe set, along with Gyromite and Rob. After a couple of years, it also shipped in a combo cart with Super Mario Bros. Eventually, Nintendo even crammed it into a triple cartridge along with Mario and World Class Track Meet for consoles that included the Power Pad exercise accessory. In America, that is. In Japan, Duck Hunt was never really regarded as anything particularly special and didn't remain in circulation for nearly as long as in the States. Clearly, Nintendo's US ambitions panned out. Duck Hunt has gone on to become an iconic part of Nintendo's history. While it wasn't enough of a game to hang a franchise or even a sequel on, the sniggering dog and frantic birds remain well loved, eventually earning a place on the latest Smash Bros. Roster. Duck Hunt also served as the impetus for Nintendo to convert Zapper games to Wii U Virtual Console, because Americans love guns, and they love Duck Hunt. On the next Good Intentions, Putt Putt joins the parade.